Nora was 24, orphaned, broke, and so dust-covered by the time she came over the ridge into Red Hollow Canyon that she looked less like a young woman than like a scrap of the road itself. The man who had stripped her family piece by piece, season by season, name by name, was Silas Sterling, a land baron so patient in cruelty that he never needed to shout when a forged paper or a bought witness could do the work for him. So when the town learned that this lone young woman in a travel-stained cream dress had laid claim to a deserted ranch for free, a dead patch of canyon everybody else had mocked as cursed, worthless, and bone-dry, they watched her the way people watch someone step too near the lip of a cliff. Below her stood the place itself, a sagging ranch house, an old windmill that turned in complaint, a wooden water tower bleaching into splinters, a stone-rimmed open well sunk like a dark eye into the earth, and miles of bright, merciless desert spread around it. They thought desperation had finally bent her mind. They did not know that buried in the silence of that ancient well was something that would change her life and reset the balance of power in the whole canyon. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten or quiet tonight, tell us in the comments below. She had been born in the dry country and taught early that desert land only looked empty to people who did not know how to listen to it. Her father used to say that a canyon kept its own calendar, and if a person meant to survive there, they had to read shade the way other folk read scripture. He showed her how the morning light struck the east walls first and where that meant a trickle of coolness might hide until noon. He showed her the silver undersides of greasewood leaves that turned before a hard wind, the pale seams where rainwater once ran and might run again, the patient labor of setting flat stones around roots. So dew would gather instead of flee. Her mother taught different wisdom, no less important. She taught her how to mend cloth so well the repair looked like ornament, how to carry herself through town when coins were few and pity was cheaper than bread, how to set beans, dried chiles, and stubborn hope into a pot and make a supper that warmed more than the stomach. Before loss came, the family had lived on canyon land farther east, a narrow but generous spread where cottonwoods marked a seasonal creek and a few head of cattle fattened enough to keep hunger outside the door. Their house had not been large, but it held the glow of oil lamps on scrubbed boards, the smell of coffee on cold dawns, and the soft country peace of people worn out by honest labor. Nora remembered lying awake as a child and hearing the wind move around the corners, while inside her mother hummed over patching, and her father, sharpening a blade or plaiting rope, told stories of the years before the territory settled into law. He spoke of surveyors lost in flash floods, of prospectors who vanished chasing mirages, of old Spanish claims and older tribal trails, of papers buried, cabins burned, and fortunes swallowed by the same sun that baked clay into brick. He always ended by saying that land remembered everything, though men often pretended otherwise. Then came the string of misfortunes that by themselves might have broken any ranching family, and together seemed almost designed. One summer, fever took Nora's younger brothers within a week of each other, leaving silence in the house like a fresh-cut wound. The next year, a late freeze killed half the kitchen garden, and a dry spell baked the creek bed into cracked scales. Her mother, who had borne grief like a lantern cupped against the wind, began to fail in the chest that winter, coughing deep and thin through the night. By spring she was gone. Nora had been scarcely 19 when she helped nail pine boards around the last of the family. Who knew how to laugh without restraint? Her father stood afterward with his hat in both hands, older by 10 years than the week before, yet he still rose every morning to do what the land demanded. He might have endured longer if the trouble had ended there. But in frontier places, sorrow rarely travels alone. Silas Sterling had been circling the canyon for years by then, buying liens, lending at smiling terms, financing freight, grain, and fencing until half the valley owed him something. He liked to call himself a builder of prosperity. We have seen men like that in every age, men who speak in the language of order while quietly arranging the ruin that makes them necessary. Sterling wanted the water routes, the grazing corridors, and every forgotten sliver of claim that might someday prove valuable. Nora's father held a piece of canyon land Sterling had failed to get from older owners, because the boundaries were tangled in pre-statehood grants and the water access, though uncertain on paper, was better in practice than outsiders understood. Sterling began with courtesy. He offered to refinance drought losses. He sent clerks with neat books and kind voices. He praised Nora's father as a hard-working man who deserved protection against bad years. Nora's father refused him twice. The third time, after cattle sickness and a broken axle ruined a shipment, he accepted a small loan meant only to tide them through autumn. The terms, written in cramped lines and buried fees, were poison wrapped in civility. New charges appeared for transport never used, storage never requested, insurance no one had asked for. A payment Sterling's own office had acknowledged suddenly went missing in the ledger. A neighbor who might have testified later claimed not to remember. A brand inspector, deep in Sterling's pocket, miscounted cattle and cited discrepancies. Then came a fire in the lower shed, suspiciously timed and swiftly blamed on negligence. Each event by itself could be explained. Together they tightened like wire. Nora learned then the desert wisdom her parents had given her was not only about weather and stone. It was also about people. Her mother had said that when a rattlesnake means to strike, it often becomes very still. Sterling grew still around their family. He did not threaten in public. He sent sympathy when Nora's father took sick from overwork and heat. He even dispatched a sack of flour one winter, the kind of gesture townspeople remembered with admiration. Meanwhile, papers moved through the county office like sand through an hourglass. Survey lines shifted. Old easements disappeared. Penalties multiplied. By the time Nora was 22, her father carried himself like a man walking beneath a roof beam that might drop at any hour. The day he died, the sun had a white, brutal glare to it, and the wash behind their house lay so dry the stones looked flayed. He had spent the morning arguing in town over a notice he swore he had never been served. Sterling himself was not present. Men like him do not always attend the moment of injury, they arrange it and allow the world to take the blame. Nora's father rode home late, exhausted, pale around the mouth, yet still determined to mend a section of fence before dark. She found him at sundown beside the post line, one hand pressed to his chest, his hat in the dust. He lived long enough to grip her wrist and tell her not to trust any account book that came from Sterling's office, and not to sell memory just because paper said memory had no value. Then he was gone, and the canyon that had once sounded like home began to sound like judgment. After the burial, the unraveling quickened. Sterling's men arrived with notices, valuations, inventories, and one clean-faced deputy who kept avoiding Nora's eyes. The cattle were taken first. Then the tools, then the wagon, on the grounds that transport collateral had been defaulted. The house stood a little longer, not from mercy but from calculation. Sterling knew spectacle had its uses. Let people see a young orphan woman turned out slowly enough for the lesson to sink in. She packed what she could into one leather satchel, her mother's sewing kit, a comb, a wrapped photograph faded to ghosts, 2 dresses, though only the patterned cream one remained fit for town, a Bible with a cracked spine, and the folded notes her father had once made about springs, washes, and rock signs through the canyon. Everything else was inventoried by men who pronounced her family's life in numbers. When she protested the charges, Sterling's clerk opened a ledger thick as a church brick and ran a finger down columns that seemed to multiply while being read aloud. Interest on missed payments. Reassessment of grazing access. Equipment replacement. Fire liability. Administrative review. The words came polished, bloodless, and absurdly calm. Nora stood in heat that smelled of hot leather and dust, listening to the theft of her life translated into legal terms. Sterling finally appeared near the end, stepping down from his buggy in a light summer coat, not a speck on him out of place. He regarded her with that mild expression some cruel people perfect, an expression that treats a wound as if it were a misunderstanding that he told her he was sorry for her losses. He said the frontier was unforgiving to families who lacked scale and capital. He said he might, in his generosity, find her placement in a household in town if she was willing to be sensible. Nora looked at him and knew at once that this was the deepest part of his scheme. He had not only wanted her father's land. He had wanted the Sterlings of the future to point to ruined families and say, you see, they were never capable of holding it. He wanted memory itself rewritten. That was why she answered him with the quietest voice she possessed and said she would sooner sleep under mesquite branches than take bread from his table, and so she did, for a time. She worked where she could. Washing linens, hauling water, mending clothes so carefully that some women in town sought her skill while still gossiping about her misfortune. She ate sparingly, learned which back doors yielded day-old loaves, and slept in an outbuilding behind a widow's place until even that arrangement ended. Yet for all the hardship, she did not let herself drift. At night she unfolded her father's notes and studied the old names of canyons, the sketched turns of dry creeks, the marks beside places half crossed out as uncertain. One name appeared more than once in the margin of older pages, Juniper Sink, a neglected ranch parcel west of town, once attached to a disputed grant older than county records. Beside it her father had written, "Water wrong on paper. Right in the ground." Keep an eye, Juniper Sink was the ranch people laughed about. An old family had tried and failed there decades earlier, later a speculator held it without living on it, later still it passed into legal fog. The house slumped, the windmill groaned, and the well was said to be dry or haunted, depending on who was telling it. Nobody wanted it because it sat in a forgotten canyon bend where freight roads ran wide around and summer heat gathered like punishment. But one market day, while Nora mended a teamster's shirt in exchange for coins, she overheard two men in the recorder's office speaking of abandoned properties the county would not chase if anyone cared to settle and improve them. Juniper Sink came up with a shrug. "Free," one said, "if anybody's fool enough." They laughed. Nora did not. She walked out there with the satchel across her shoulder and the cream dress dusting against her boots, following the path over the hill until the ranch opened below her exactly as if the earth had held its breath waiting. The sight of it was harsher than rumor, the yard all stone and weeds, the corral leaning, the main house with shutters hanging like tired eyelids, the water tower warped silver gray by years of sun. Yet there was structure still. There was a stubborn frame. And there, nearest the house, ringed in fitted stone, lay the well. Open. Deep. Silent in the noon glare. Nora stood on the ridge while heat shimmered above the yard and the windmill turned with a long complaining creak, and for a moment she felt something between fear and recognition. The place looked discarded, yes, but not dead. It looked like one of those seeds desert flowers keep hidden through punishing seasons, waiting for the one storm that tells them to begin. The townspeople called it madness when she declared her intent and marked her claim in the simple, lawful way she could. A widow at the boarding house pressed her lips and said a woman alone could not last 1 week out there. A stableman asked whether she expected dust to hatch chickens and gold to flow from the pump. Nora said very little. She took a kettle, a blanket, a tin plate, a bit of flour, a flint striker, and started west before dawn, while the air still held a trace of mercy. By the time she reached the ranch and set her satchel on the porch, the sun was already climbing into its merciless throne. The first days were a trial of body and patience. She swept bat droppings from corners and dead leaves from rooms where the wallpaper had long ago surrendered. She patched one window with old feed sack. She found a cast-iron stove rusted but sound, and a cupboard containing a cracked blue plate, 3 empty jars, and a child's marble left behind by people whose names no one now remembered. At dusk the desert cooled quickly enough to raise gooseflesh on her arms, and coyotes barked somewhere among the washes. By noon the next day the heat beat on the roof so fiercely she felt the whole house might drift into light. She covered her neck with a rag, tied back her blonde hair, and worked anyway, hauling debris, propping beams, gathering cactus fruit and mesquite for fuel, tracing with her feet the lay of the land. Her father's notes proved true in subtle ways. There was a shallow seam where runoff had once crossed the yard, and beneath a cluster of rocks she found dampness the soil was trying to hide. Lizards disappeared at a certain hour behind the north wall of the well, where shade lasted longest. The old windmill, though stiff, was not beyond repair. The water tower smelled of dry cedar and old iron, but its supports, with bracing, might hold. Every small discovery steadied her. So did the well itself, though it unsettled her too. In daylight, when she leaned over the stone rim and dropped a pebble, the echo came back oddly delayed, as if the shaft widened far below. No water answered, only a faint metallic aftersound that did not belong to stone. On the fourth night the whisper began in earnest. Near midnight Nora woke on her blanket to a measured, delicate ringing, too light for machinery, too regular for accident. The wind had risen and was moving through cracks in the house with a thin reed-like moan. Outside, dust devils traveled pale under the moon. She sat very still, listening. Ring. Pause. Ring. A dry, metallic note, seeming to come from the yard. She took her lantern and stepped onto the porch. The windmill blades turned once, then rested. The water tower creaked. Again came the sound, faint and hollow, from the well. Most people later said they would have waited for daylight. Perhaps they would have. But Nora had lived too long at the mercy of what other people claimed was sensible. She crossed the yard with the lantern held low, the flame hissing behind its glass. At the rim she listened again. Ring. Not from the top, not from the wind, but from somewhere deep below, where the lantern light failed and the darkness swallowed it whole. She lowered the bucket rope a little and heard the sound change, then cease. When she drew it back up, the frayed line smelled of age, minerals, and something faintly oily, not like fresh water at all. She slept little that night. By dawn she had made up her mind. The next day she scavenged the ranch for usable rope, a pry bar, and an old iron hook. In a shed half collapsed behind the corral she found a coil of line stiff with dust but strong in the middle, and beneath a workbench a narrow ladder section that had once served the water tower. She spent the afternoon securing what she could, measuring by dropped stone and echo. The well had handholds mortared into one side, nearly invisible from above, as if someone long ago had expected a person to climb partway down. That discovery alone would have sent some hearts racing. It sent Nora's into a solemn, careful beat. She ate a crust, waited for the murderous heat to pass, and at sundown lit the lantern again that we can imagine the descent because many of us have known what it is to go down into the dark searching for the one answer that may save the rest of our life. The stone was cool beneath her fingers, a relief after days of sun. Dust and grit came loose under her boots and pattered down into unseen depth. The lantern threw gold on the shaft walls, showing old masonry, mineral streaks, and the ghostly remains of tool marks from hands long dead. The air changed as she descended. It held not moisture exactly, but an underground stillness, a preserved breath. Halfway down she found the source of the metallic whisper, a rusted length of chain suspended against the wall, nudged by drafts that moved through some hidden opening. Yet the chain itself hung beside something stranger. Set into the stone was a square section of masonry less worn than the rest, as though repaired or concealed after the well had first been built. One corner stood slightly proud. Nora wedged herself against the wall, set the lantern on an iron nub, and pressed at it. Nothing. She tried the pry bar. Mortar flaked. The panel shifted with a stubborn groan and opened inward just enough to release a wash of air smelling of oilskin, iron, and old paper. Behind it was a cavity cut into the earth and shored with timber, a vault no larger than a pantry but made with exquisite care. Inside, dry as bone and dark as buried years, sat 2 tin strongboxes, 3 oilskin bundles, and a leather ledger case stamped with initials worn nearly away. For a long moment Nora only stared. The lantern flame trembled, making the brass corners glint. Her hands shook, not with greed, but with the uncanny feeling that the land her father had trusted had at last answered. She hauled the first bundle into the lantern light and unwound the oilskin. Gold eagles rolled against one another with a dense, soft clink, far heavier in sound than ordinary coin, stamped from years before the territory had become a state. Another bundle held more, though fewer, wrapped alongside a small velvet pouch of unset stones. The strongboxes were harder to open, one had rusted nearly shut. Inside lay folded deeds and patent records, original and sealed, their edges browned but their writing preserved by the dry air. Names leapt from the pages, families long pushed off the canyon, acre boundaries Sterling had later claimed were uncertain, notations tying parcels together in ways the county office no longer acknowledged. Then came the ledger case. Nora climbed out with the bundles before she dared read by full light, because some instincts tell us to get the truth into open air before darkness persuades us it was imagined. She spread the contents on her kitchen table under dawn's first grayness. Several books were commercial ledgers from years back, not ancient at all. These were devastating in a different way. They bore the markings of Sterling's early operations: duplicate account numbers, false shortfalls, payments entered in one column and erased in another, survey fees charged against families for work never completed, signatures from county men later promoted, initials linking land seizures to staged defaults. Tucked between pages was correspondence copied in clerk's hand, enough to show deliberate fraud reaching back years, maybe decades. One folded note, unsigned but plainly meant for an accomplice, referred to the old Canyon grant papers concealed at Juniper until title quieted. Juniper. The abandoned ranch itself had once been used as a hiding place. Nora sat there while morning widened around the broken house, and the whole line of her life seemed to gather into one clear direction. She cried then, but not in the wild way of fresh grief. These were the tears of a person who has been told for too long that loss was weather, misfortune, fate, weakness, anything but intention, and who suddenly holds proof that the wound had a hand behind it. She touched her father's notes beside the recovered deeds and whispered aloud that he had been right. Paper had lied. Memory had not. Prudence came back quickly. She rewrapped the gold, hid it in separate places within the house and shed, and copied by hand the most damning pages of the ledgers in case originals were stolen. Then she took the oldest patent record and one ledger excerpt into town, not to Sterling's allies, but to a retired schoolmaster named Elias Boone who had once taught county clerks penmanship before failing eyesight and age put him on his porch with a blanket across his knees. Boone had known her father. He examined the documents with a care that made the afternoon disappear. At last he looked up, eyes watery but sharp in spirit, and said what Nora already knew: these were real, old, and explosive. He advised her to go straight to the circuit judge in the larger town 2 days south when next court sat, and to tell no one unnecessary. But secrets on the frontier move like dust through screen doors. By the next evening, Silas Sterling had heard enough to come writing that he arrived at Juniper Sink in the blaze of late afternoon with 3 men, each armed more with confidence than weapons. Though rifles sat visible in their scabbards. Sterling did not dismount at once. He took in the swept yard, the repaired porch rail, the smoke lifting from Nora's cook fire, the windmill now turning more cleanly after her labor, and something in his face tightened. It was not merely anger. It was recognition that the thing he had discarded was becoming orderly under another hand, and that such order might gather witnesses. He called her a squatter in a tone used for servants. He said the county records were under review. He said improvements did not establish ownership where none existed. One of his men moved toward the house as if to begin taking inventory. Nora stepped from the shade into the full heat, hatless, the sun laying a hard rim of light along her hair. She looked smaller than the mounted men, smaller than Sterling's shadow, smaller than the ruined machinery and the long yard between them. Yet some presences are not measured in size. She held a packet of papers against her skirt with one hand and rested the other on the stone rim of the well as if drawing steadiness from the earth itself. When she spoke, she did not raise her voice. She told Sterling he would not touch one nail of the property. She told him the original patents for Juniper and adjoining claims had been recovered from a concealed vault beneath the well on which he himself had once hidden them. She told him she possessed ledgers proving systematic fraud against multiple families, including her own. Men who depend on intimidation often falter at the first sight of calm certainty. Sterling tried first to laugh. Then he demanded to see what she claimed. Nora answered that he could see them in the circuit court, in front of a judge, with witnesses present. One of his men swung down from the saddle and strode 2 steps forward, only to stop when Nora named him from a notation in the books, identifying an alias used on survey receipts 15 years earlier. The man went pale beneath the dust. Sterling turned on him so quickly that the whole arrangement among them flashed visible: fear, loyalty bought and thinning, old crimes suddenly made personal. He dismounted then and came closer, not near enough to touch, but near enough for Nora to smell citrus hair tonic beneath horse sweat and heat. He lowered his voice, which can be more dangerous than a shout. He offered settlement. He spoke of unfortunate clerical misunderstandings in earlier years. He suggested the gold, if gold there was, could disappear in many ways unless handled through respectable channels. He promised Nora a comfortable sum, a house in town, security. We know that tone too. It is the tone used when power still believes everything has its price. Nora looked past him at the canyon, at the hard pale hills and the yard she had begun to bring back to life, and said she was not standing there for comfort. She was standing there for the dead, for the ruined, and for the truth Sterling had buried because he thought poor people could not keep hold of paper long enough to make it matter. Perhaps he would have risked seizing the evidence anyway if the scene had remained private. But word had trailed him. 2 ranch hands from neighboring tracks had paused on the road, then a widow from half a mile off, then Boone himself in a borrowed cart, because old men sometimes move faster than rumor when justice is finally within reach. By the time Sterling understood he had an audience, the balance had shifted. He could threaten Nora alone. He could not as easily threaten the canyon once it had started looking back at him with one pair of eyes after another. He mounted without another word. Yet before he turned away, he looked once at the well, and the fear in him then was plain. Not fear of Nora. Fear of what the earth had kept against him. The circuit court sat 3 days later in a brick building, hotter inside than out, with ceiling fans barely stirring the smell of ink, wool, and dust. Nora arrived in her cream dress freshly mended, her satchel holding copies and originals wrapped against harm. Boone testified first to the age and authenticity of the patents. Then a surveyor from another county, summoned in haste by the judge after a first review, explained how the old grants aligned and how later filings under Sterling's interests had depended on omissions too convenient to be accidental. One by one, ledger pages were read. Missing payments. Inflated debts. Sham fees. Duplicate accounts. Testimony emerged from people who had been silent for years because silence had seemed safer than speaking against a man who could starve them through credit. Once the door cracked open, voices came through it like long-awaited rain. Reputation. He called the records incomplete. He called them maliciously interpreted. He called Nora an unstable woman led by bitterness. But the arithmetic betrayed him, and the old patents undermined half the story he had sold the canyon about uncertainty of title. When the unsigned note referencing Juniper Sink was produced, and when one former clerk admitted under pressure that Sterling had ordered older files removed from county drawers, for safekeeping, during a records transfer, the room changed. People no longer watched a powerful man inconvenienced. They watched a structure of theft beginning to collapse under its own weight. The judge was not a poetic man, but he was exact, and exactness can feel like mercy in a lawless place. He ordered immediate seizure of disputed ledgers and suspension of several Sterling claims pending full review. He recognized Nora's settlement and improvement rights at Juniper Sink, affirmed the original standing of the recovered patent records subject to formal recording, and appointed an emergency commission to examine prior foreclosures tied to Sterling's offices. Some properties could not be restored, time had already carried them too far. But many could. Families once told they had defaulted beyond appeal saw fresh hearings granted. Liens vanished where none should have existed. Water rights were corrected. A canyon that had grown used to bowing its head began, little by little, to straighten its spine. As for Sterling, his power did not disappear in one thunderclap. In the frontier, reckoning more often resembles erosion than lightning. Men withdrew business. Associates talked. Credit tightened. Cases multiplied. The polish that had protected him wore off, revealing not majesty but appetite. Within a year he sold portions of his holdings at reduced price to cover judgments and legal costs. Within 2, he had left the region altogether, a diminished figure rolling east under the same pitiless sun he had once imagined obeyed him. Nora stayed at Juniper Sink. That is perhaps the most important part, because justice alone does not make a home, someone must build after the verdict. She used a portion of the recovered gold lawfully, openly, recorded before witnesses, to repair the ranch and stabilize the claim. She hired men and women who had lost work under Sterling's monopolies. The windmill was rebuilt true. The water tower was braced and planked anew. And the well, after careful clearing below the vault level, yielded a narrow but dependable source when channeled with patience and skill, exactly as her father's notes had suggested, wrong on paper, right in the ground. Nora planted shade trees first, because anyone raised in harsh country knows hope must sometimes begin with shade. Then beans, squash, and fruit where runoff could be trapped. Chickens came. A milk cow. Later, 2 orphaned boys from a family broken by one of Sterling's false seizures found board there and then belonging. People began calling the place a sanctuary before Nora ever did. Travelers could count on water. Widows knew there might be mending work or a meal. Men trying to re-establish small herds could trade labor for seed and tools. The ranch did not become grand. It became sound, which is finer. At evening the once abandoned yard held the low talk of workers, the smell of bread, the rasp of cicadas, and the turning complaint of a windmill now working for life instead of decay. Nora remained dignified, spare in speech, and stronger than many understood. She never made a spectacle of victory. She simply kept faith with the land, with the dead who had trusted truth more than paper, and with the living who still needed one place in the canyon where being poor did not mean being prey. And when we think back to that first image of her on the dusty hill path, cream dress travel-stained, satchel carrying almost all she owned, blonde hair lifted by the hot wind while she looked down at a ranch everyone else had judged finished, we understand why some stories belong to the quiet places. The world is quick to name things worthless when it has no patience to look beneath the surface. A dry well, a ruined house, a canyon lot left to scorch under merciless light, an orphaned young woman with no money and no protector, such things are easily dismissed by those who measure value only by immediate ease or public applause. But the earth keeps deeper books. Sometimes truth lies under stone, sealed against bad men and waiting for the one pair of hands stubborn enough, honest enough, and wounded enough to search for it. Nora's name endured in Red Hollow not because she found gold, though she did, nor because a judge ruled in her favor, though he did. It endured because she proved that what has been abandoned is not always empty, and what has been broken is not always finished. She took the place others feared, listened to what it was trying to say, and answered it with labor instead of ridicule. In doing so she restored more than a ranch. She restored memory to families who had nearly been argued out of their own lives. She reminded a whole canyon that fraud may prosper for a season, but it never truly owns the ground beneath it. The most precious things are often hidden where arrogance will not stoop to search, in dry wells, in forgotten papers, in old skills passed from parent to child, in the steady courage of a woman the world mistook for powerless. So if you ever find yourself standing on your own dusty ridge, looking down at some part of life others have dismissed as ruined beyond repair, think of Nora. Think of the windmill creaking under the bright hard sun, the stone-rimmed well holding its dark counsel, and the lone figure who stepped forward when wiser people stepped back. Sometimes hope does not arrive dressed as miracle. Sometimes it arrives as work, as listening, as one more descent into the dark with a lantern in your hand. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. What is a time you found value or hope in something others had completely written off? Until next time, stay close.